On today's World Insight,
Constitution of the United States.
Constitution of the United States.
a year since moving to the White House, the ups and downs of Joe Biden's presidency, where he stood tall and where he fell short. What are the highlights of his first year in office? What lies ahead for Biden's presidency this year?
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. U.S. President Joe Biden admits Americans have grown wary of a resurgent pandemic in a news conference Wednesday, marking his first year in office. He insists, though, that U.S. voters will take a more positive view of his tenure in time. It's been a tumultuous year for Biden as his approval ratings have taken a hit and much of his legislative agenda have stalled in Congress. He took office pledging to contain COVID, but fell way short of that promise with Delta and Omicron-filled infection spikes. A political battle is raging over voting rights as Republicans are keen on pushing restrictions. On the economy, unemployment rate fell, but inflation soared to its highest in 40 years. On climate, the U.S. rejoined the Paris Accord and sought common ground with China on climate action. So what kind of world does the U.S. want to forge? And with this in mind, what role does the U.S. play? But it all starts with its own domestic agenda. Let's loop in our panelists. In Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science at the University of Iowa. In Washington, D.C., Rick Dunham, a veteran political journalist. In Beijing, Yang Xiyu, senior research fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Now, Professor Hagel, the approval rating is not very satisfactory. However, Mr. Biden, at least in public, seems to be quite confident.
That's no surprise. In fact, in his press conference yesterday, he read off a list of what he believed to be accomplishments, and it sounded a little bit like what he might say in a State of the Union address. And politicians are going to do that. They're going to try to a certain extent point to the positive, and to some extent, President Biden and his administration feel that they just haven't done a good enough job in terms of conveying their message, and so they want to try to do that. But unfortunately, the public isn't seeing it for a lot of the reasons that you indicated in your introduction, that basically the people are looking at it in terms of, in particular, their pocketbook. As the saying goes back from when Clinton was running for President Bill Clinton, that's the economy. And so that's the thing that Biden has to focus on, and hasn't been able to do much about it. As you indicated, inflation is up, prices are up, and so forth. And that could potentially hurt him dramatically in terms of the midterm elections.
Right. The domestic agenda has a lot to do with politics, also has a lot to do with the economy, and certainly with the pandemic. In the face of an unrelenting pandemic and soaring inflation, President Biden, as we mentioned earlier, ends his first year in the White House with clear majority of Americans for the very first time disapproving of his handling of the presidency. A latest poll shows, here's the number, 56% disapproval to 43% approval. The poll also shows Americans' confidence in Biden's handling of the pandemic has further eroded now. Just 45% say they approve, down from 57% in December. Those are the latest. Of course, opinion polls, you could read it this way or that. However, some of these numbers, when you look at the trend, certainly tells the story. Now, Mr. Dunham, you've been a veteran journalist in Washington, D.C. Earlier, you were in China for several years, observing both from close and from afar. What do you think of the current political battle? Some analysts projected as, describe it rather, as Americans against Americans. Has that changed? Do you think Mr. Biden will have the power to make that change?
Well, I think you raised good points here. First, you can't dispute the numbers. Joe Biden is the second least popular president in modern times after 1 year. The most unpopular was Donald Trump. He's following a trajectory of past presidents, including Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan, where their popularity went down with economic challenges. They rebounded. Trump never rebounded to victory. But I think a lot of the problem with Joe Biden is that he's is the politics, and he's acting like he's president of the United States Senate, where he served for decades, rather than being president of the United States. And when you look at it, he's liked by people, by lawmakers of both parties, but he's not feared. He's respected, he's liked. Donald Trump was not respected, Donald Trump was not liked, but he was feared and he got things done. So I think Joe Biden has to stop being the chum of his former colleagues and reach out to the people to lead and to get people in Congress to be afraid of being on the other side of popular issues that Biden's supporting.
It seems that a lot of things are becoming so binary, Professor Hagel, that some say Americans are fighting the same old battle, just on new battlegrounds. For example, about racial issue. For example, about the pandemic, whether you have the vaccines or not. And for example, the issues of many social cohesion related problems. So Professor Hagel, what is your take? Is Mr. Biden magically bringing some light to these issues?
I don't think that he's bringing sunlight to them, that basically the problem that you highlight is something that transcends Biden, that he basically has to deal with this environment that he's found himself in now that he's president. And unfortunately, for the last several years, and it may be intensified when Donald Trump became president, that almost everything becomes political. And it doesn't matter how much support you have, the politicians are playing to their base, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans, conservatives or liberals, however you want to phrase it. And everything becomes so political so quickly that it's often very difficult to find a solution to whatever the problem happens to be. And the pandemic is a good example of that, where things became so political because it seemed the Democrats saw this as a good way to attack Donald Trump, and it was, that then it became difficult to deal with the pandemic in really a good way. And we're sort of still stuck in this. And how do we deal with whatever's coming our way, whether it's the Delta or Omicron variants or something else? And as you indicated earlier, American people are just getting weary of this because they're getting mixed messages and so forth, and becomes, again, so highly political. And Biden really can't solve that particular problem, at least not by himself.
Mr. Dunham, the pandemic issue, is it going to be remembered as a achievement for President Biden, or a failure? Do we see part of the picture already?
I don't think we see the picture yet. I think we have to wait for 2 years. If you remember last spring, when it looked like the numbers were going down, when they were going down, his handling of it was very popular in the United States. Now we've had 2 separate waves with 2 variants, and a majority of people in the United States disapprove. I think Joe Biden is doing just about everything he can. In fact, the Supreme Court is reining him in when he wanted to mandate that employers require vaccinations. I think that the problem is there's so many people who are resisting getting vaccinated, wearing masks, taking the precautions, that the pandemic has become political. It'll just depend what happens with the disease and with variants over the next 2 years, whether Joe Biden is remembered positively or negatively. I think he has very little control.
Racial issue is another issue, of course, that has been there for quite some time, inherited this time by President Biden during his tenure. Professor Hagel, there are so many cases that are becoming the center of attention over the past year, and it seems that things are getting ever more intense.
They are, and they really don't need to be. That I think that this is maybe an area where you probably could find some common ground. but certain elements of both parties are resisting, trying to find that common ground. And some folks are pushing, and they want to make divisive issues because that helps politically their base. And one of the things, particularly right now, because usually the party not of the president does well in the midterm elections. And given the feelings that the public has, according to polls of President Biden, Democrats are looking very dispirited towards the midterm elections. And so they have to find some way to basically energize their base. And if the roles were reversed, the same would be true. Republicans trying to energize their base as well. Well, in this case, it's the Democrats that need to have that. And so they're sort of trying to rile up their base by finding various issues. On the other hand, Republicans are also finding issues to rile up their base in various ways. And sometimes it's legitimate complaints that they have, but other times it's basically more just to try to get their base energized for those midterm elections because they think it's either that they need that or that they're going to go on to victory.
Political strategies are one thing. However, some of the latest disputes going on in the U.S. are pointing, some suggest, to the very fundamental values of the United States and also the fundamental systems that many Americans over the years feel proud of. For example, about the election, there is the dispute of exactly who the president should be. That is still being debated or disputed, shall I put it in a more appropriate way. And the two parties are actually campaigning with those very different perceptions about who the president should be. And that goes to the fundamental of the democratic system of election and the basic rules of the election, which the Americans have been quite proud of. Now, this is not about one system versus another system. I'm asking it about, how is it likely domestic agenda by the Biden administration going to address that issue? Professor Hagel, maybe briefly.
Well, it's hard to say that certainly what we've seen, and we saw that to a certain extent in the press conference yesterday when President Biden was asked a question about whether he thought the midterm elections were going to be conducted in a fair and honest way, and he hesitated on that. And that's one of the things that the Democrats have been pushing of late, that their call, and you're sort of hinting at this in your question, their call that maybe that democracy is under threat right now. And I don't think that's true at all. That certainly we always have concerns, and we've had problems in the past of, counting votes or how things go. And especially when you put the electoral system under a microscope, as sometimes happens, like in the 2000 elections when the Florida counting the votes down there, that became, you're going to find human error, you're going to find some things. And always we try to fix that.
In the year 2000, after the election, the other party conceded, but this time didn't. And his voters continue to say that they actually got the majority of the vote, should be in the White House. So I think there's a fundamental difference between 2000 and now, isn't it?
There is that difference, no doubt about that. One of the things, and this is what Democrats refer to as the big lie, that Trump lied about this. But having said that, there were some concerns about what happened and how votes were counted and some mysterious stoppages of the vote and all of that. Now, whether that made a difference, for the most part, it doesn't seem so. And many court cases indicated that that was true. Okay. But we do have a situation where you want to make sure that the votes that are cast legally and counted appropriately, and they should be fairly transparent. And because we rely on states to do that, that can sometimes cause problems. That's one of the things that the voting rights bill that Biden is pushing wants to have a more federalized approach to this. And so far, it hasn't gotten through the Senate.
So that is my question, really, about the fundamentals of the system, the so-called accuracy of the system, the belief that people still have in that system. I mean, the U.S. is free to choose whatever political system that the U.S. wants or the Americans wants, but on that system, is there enough belief, and what would that mean leading up to the next midterm election and finally the presidential election 3 years from now? Mr. Duncan, I know it's too much to ask within one question. We can debate about that for hours, but to you, what is that sense?
I agree with your concerns, Chin Wei. The first set of issues has to do with the sanctity of the presidential election. And I think that Joe Biden has to work with the Republicans, at least moderate Republicans, as many as there are, to try to come up with a bipartisan solution so you could not have a vice president do what Donald Trump wanted, which is to overturn the votes in the states. There's a law that has to do with counting electoral votes that goes back to the 19th century. It needs to be overhauled, and Joe Biden needs to work with a few Republicans to get it done. The second part is the sanctity of the vote and all of the restrictions that are going on around the country. Somehow Joe Biden has to figure out how to get to 51 votes in the Senate to do something about it. And that means reaching out to Republicans, because there are two Democrats he's lost. He has to talk to people like Mitt Romney, like Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, like Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, and try to figure out, like he did with the infrastructure, do something so that there is no question about people, particular minorities, not being allowed to vote in this election.
Our two American guests have been talking a lot about the realities and the strategies, it seems, because you are within the country. It is your country. You are certainly passionate about it. However, Professor Yang, who is from China, we are observing from afar, putting geopolitics aside. Professor Yang, you've been doing American studies for years. Your take on how you observe what's going on inside that country, even though we haven't got the chance to travel yet, about the latest and the Biden year on the domestic agenda.
Well, let me put it by this way. Just now you mentioned the new battle, the old battle with the old new battleground. The new battleground, it seems to me, is a very divided politics in the United States. Now, no matter who win the president or majority of the Capitol Hill, will lead to the totally different political direction. Say, if Democrats win, then the U.S. will turn towards the left forward, or go to the right forward. That is why U.S. now is hesitating at a historical crossroad without any clear sense where we should go and how we should go. No any clear source, no any unified consensus among Americans. That is the fundamental challenge facing Americans. That is why all the uncertainties of politics, economics cannot solve, no matter who wins the election.
Well, we're certainly going to talk about some of those issues you just mentioned, and this is World Insight. We're talking about U.S. President Joe Biden's first year in the office. We're going to zero in later on soaring U.S. inflation, seen as the highest in a generation, plus how well did he, the U.S. president, do on his foreign policy. Stay tuned. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Troubles at home may have weighed heavily on U.S. President Joe Biden's first year and also on his foreign policy, some argue. He promised to re-engage with the international community after a fractious period under his predecessor, Donald Trump. He did return the U.S. to the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization. He also sought to shore up ties with Quad allies and signed a controversial nuclear deal with Australia and Britain. Meanwhile, America's chaotic exit from Afghanistan has received heavy criticism. No major breakthrough also has been made on reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, though negotiations are underway. So could the U.S. approach of my way or the highway still hold in today's closely interconnected world? Can the U.S. afford to keep a unipolar world, as some in that country advocate? Let's bring in our panelists once again. Professor Hagel. We are joined by Professor Hagel from Iowa, veteran political journalist Rick Dunham from Washington, D.C., and Yang Xiyu in Beijing, an analyst on the U.S. policy. Now, let's talk about international relations and also the foreign policy of the Biden administration. Certainly a big change observed from afar, Professor Yang, in terms of whether the U.S. still want to engage with the world from his predecessor, Donald Trump. But there seems to be some very interesting approach to use maybe a very modest word of this administration.
Well, I think Biden administration revised many aspects of Trump policy, but the foreign policy. Basically, since 2017, when Trump refocused the national strategy from international terrorism onto Russia and China, and Biden continued this focus and strengthened their strategic pressures on the new focus, say Russia and China. Say basically during the past 1 year, Biden has opened 2 battlefronts against both Russia and China.
Yeah.
On the surface, U.S. has been quite active, aggressive, offensive, but in long run, that will accumulate a huge cost that damage American strength and national interests. And gradually, U.S. Will certainly be failed to deal with such a dual battlefronts.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Well, that certainly could be a view coming from China. But to the 2 American panelists that are joining us, you look at it from within. How has the Biden administration first year been doing? Certainly some change compared to the predecessor, but some remain the same or even more intense. For example, relationship with Russia, relationship with China, some argue. And at the same time, the U.S. aspires to rebuild a world in which the U.S. could be the ultimate benefactor. But the question really is, can the U.S. do that? Will the U.S. have the capability to do that? And will others follow? So out of that bigger context, Mr. Dunham, how do you think the Biden administration has been doing first year?
Well, let's start with the numbers, just like we did with the public opinion about his approval. Globally, in almost every country in the world, the United States is seen more positively, with the exception of Russia, of those countries polled. In the United States, Joe Biden's foreign policy is not popular overall. People do not think that he is tough enough on China in particular when that question is asked. I think that Joe Biden has had victories in bringing the United States back into the world order, whether it is cooperating with countries such as China on global warming, on climate change, but also reestablishing the alliances. But he's also had failures that really are hurtful. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster, a policy disaster, a public relations debacle, and it raises questions about the United States' commitment once it goes into places. And I think that you're right in terms of foreign policy. He hasn't changed many of Donald Trump's policies. The big picture, the United States respecting the rest of the world, yes. But he's still tough on China. He's still building the Indo-Pacific alliance, the Quad, and he has shifted from the war on terror to a look at strategic challenges with China and Russia, and much tougher on Russia than Donald Trump was.
Professor Hagel, of course, you're a political analyst. You mainly look at things from the political angle. Now, how much do you see this agenda of President Biden, particularly the performance of President Biden, foreign policy-wise, is shaped by politics?
Well, it's certainly always shaped by politics, regardless of what the politicians are doing. There's always that sort of something in the back of their mind that they may have certain goals that they want to do in terms of just policy in general, hopefully to advance the interests of the United States or whatever it happens to be. But there's always a political aspect to what's going on, and that's no surprise, and there's nothing wrong with that they may be looking towards the next election. But this is one of those things where, in particular, President Biden ran on, and Democrats generally ran on the fact that they thought that President Trump had soured relations with a number of countries. Well, I could go back to what Mr. Dunham was saying in terms of that Trump was one of these folks that was maybe not respected very much, but he was feared. And the opposite, perhaps, is the case for Biden. And the problem with Biden is he may not be able to get certain things done if he's not pushing hard enough. Now, Biden's view of this is that, well, I need to get along with our allies in order to get things done. Well, so far that hasn't happened. Afghanistan was sort of one example of that, and I think perhaps some allies are maybe a little concerned about how that happened. Some things that Biden said in his press conference yesterday with regard to Russia and Ukraine have made some people very anxious, even though the administration tried to walk those comments back. And so it's one of those things where we're still early in Biden's administration. He may be trying to repair those relationships, but it's hard to say if he's been very successful in doing so.
Professor Yang, one of the concerns that others, for example, China might have is whether the current administration is using its foreign policy to advance its domestic political agenda. Now, of course, everything is related. It's everywhere in the world, but to what degree, that is probably the most important thing. Since we're talking about the Biden administration in our discussion today, how do you see that is interlinked between the domestic political agenda, the election season, and the party lines, and also the Biden administration's choices of foreign policies?
Well, I think the answer could be very complex. On one hand, on some of fundamental domestic issues like a pandemic and economic issue need cooperation rather than confrontation between the two big countries. But on the other hand, China has become more and more unpopular in American politics. And in many cases, the administration need to make use of China as a leverage, not only for foreign policy, but also for domestic politics. For example, the so-called American value. I can imagine with more and more intervention based on American value, domestically they will get more and more credits, but that will make more damage on the China-U.S. relation.
I see. Well, things are complicated as always. It's only the first year. There are 3 more years to go, and a lot of things are happening already for the very first year, certainly in the world as well. We'll probably have to wait and see, but one thing is for sure, with the midterm election and the inflation going on, things are going to get complicated. Before we wrap it up, I want to read further numbers just to indicate the complexity of it. Americans are even more skeptical of Biden's handling of the economy, with just 37% approving. Growing anger also about the economic policies comes as inflation rose at its fastest pace in nearly 40 years last month, a 7% spike from a year earlier that is increasing household expenses and eating into wage gains. Many governments and countries are dealing with many problems they have as a result of pandemic and other things, but certainly the Biden administration will have a lot of work to do. Having said that, though, we're wrapping up today's program. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more Search World Insight, check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.